So officially hi to everyone, to the panelists and to attendees. Welcome to the Northern Forest Climate Threats to our biggest carbon sink on land and how to protect it. My name is Eric de Castro. I'm a policy analyst at CAN Europe, and I'm happy to moderate this event today. As you know, climate change and biodiversity loss are twin crises, and the forests are one of the most threatened biomes. Studies show that a larger share of forests are in poor condition and that the world remains off track to reach the goals of halting deforestation and the forest degradation. Today, we will focus on northern forests and that is also called boreal forests. They are among the most critical ecosystems on our planet, playing a huge role on terrestrial carbon sinks and therefore in regulating our climate. However, these forests are under increasing threat from unsustainable practices to climate change and climate change impact. At the same time, they hold also immense potential to help us limit temperature rise to 1.5. To delve into that, two recent studies focus on the climate impacts affecting northern forests and also on the necessary actions to protect them and their ability to fight climate change. First, we'll have Research Associate Dalia Kalu present key finds on climate impacts in northern forests. And then Firsa Rini, data and land use analyst, will discuss the critical role of boreal forests in limiting global warming to 1.5. Both of them are from climate analytics. After that, our expert panel will reach to the presentations focusing on international climate negotiations, report and accounting of carbon, the impact of sustainable logging on those kind of forces, and the way forward to drive ambition in global climate action. So I think on my side that's that, and I'm pleased to give Dalia the floor. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erich, and welcome everyone. I will start with giving a brief outline of the reports that we have written, and specifically on the climate impacts in northern forests. But to first set the scene a bit more, what are we even talking about when we talk about northern forests? Our definition of northern forests include the boreal and temperate forests of the northern hemisphere, as well as Mediterranean forests. And here you can just see two maps. So we are covering quite a lot of land mass. And these forests cover up to 50% of global forest areas. This also means that they are a very important part of our climate system because forests act as a carbon sink. We talk a lot about saving tropical forests, for example, to make sure that they keep being our lungs of the world, but northern forests are equally as important. And apart from being forest sinks, they also store a large amount of carbon. So northern forests hold around half of the world's total carbon stock, and over half of that carbon stock is actually stored in the forest soils, so not in the trees themselves. And this makes northern forests especially important to protect, because if we cut down these forests, the carbon stocks could be released from the soils and actually become a source instead of protecting and being a part of our climate solutions. So it's important to keep in mind that we have large carbon stocks that are current storages of carbon. And then just to go a bit further into the overall, what are the impacts? We already see climate change. Probably most of you have seen the latest news of the climate warming of the past year. For the first time, we have been above 1.5 globally. This does not mean that climate change and global warming has been above 1.5 in total, because when we talk about, for example, the Paris Agreement 1.5 goal, we talk about an average over decades, which we cannot say right now where we are at. So this 1.5 is still in line, but we are seeing global warming at alarming rates, and we are seeing an amplification of warming in the northern latitudes, especially in the high latitudes, and we also see higher warming over land compared to oceans. So northern forests see an increased amount of warming. And to give some other numbers, the past decade, between 2014 to 2023, we have seen global mean surface temperatures of 1.19 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial reference, and the land surfaces have warmed by 1.71 degrees compared to pre-industrial. So there's a large difference. And in some of the high latitudes, we can see temperature anomalies of up to 6 degrees. What does this mean for impacts and for the forests? This is a bit of a complicated graphic, so I want you to focus on warming in the upper part. So we are seeing warming, and what does this mean for environmental conditions? In yellow, ecosystem processes; in red, vegetation; in green, and microorganisms in this grayish green. The red arrows mean positive impacts, where, for example, increased warming will lead to increased drought. So positive is not a judgment call in this case. And blue is a negative impact. And if we focus again on warming, we can see that warming will lead to increased drought, and forests that are impacted by increased drought are less resilient to the impacts of biotic pests. So we do not only have impacts themselves, but we also see impacts interacting with each other and amplifying each other. Another example that is being talked about a lot, again, right now with the LA fires, are wildfires in general. In 2023, there were large extent of forest fires in Canada. Many of you might remember these images of New York up in smog because some of the fumes from the fires made it all the way to New York. These fires were quite unprecedented in Canada. They burned an unprecedented area as well as released a lot of CO2. And now there has been a recent attribution study that has shown that these fires were made a lot more likely by climate change. The extent of the area burned was increased by twofold in eastern Canada, and the fire season length was increased by more than 5 times just through climate change. Also, the likelihood of having extreme fire weather, so this means, for example, having dry conditions, having the right wind, and actually having the right conditions for a fire to start, where in all these different places, so pretty much across all of Canada, was made more likely by climate change. This, I think, Jennifer will talk about later a bit more, but it's also important to note that it's not only made more likely by climate change, but also by other anthropogenic impacts, such as logging and changing forests. And just to say that it is important to consider that primary forests are more resilient to climate change. So one thing that we need to be careful here is to talk about how can we adapt to this? How can we make forests more resilient? And the very first step would be to conserve what is left and keep them in the most natural state that we can. And one last point that I would like to talk about are tipping points. So tipping points are critical thresholds beyond which systems reorganize, often abruptly and or irreversibly. And in the northern forests, there are 2 tipping elements that are defined. One is the dieback of forests in the southern regions. Because of climate change, again, a lot of tree species cannot survive in the current conditions. And the boreal forest especially is retreating further north. And the southern forest dieback can lead to large carbon emissions and therefore still make climate change even more extremes. And this is, again, a cycle that impacts each other. And then another tipping element that has been identified is the expansion of northern forests in the north, so into the Arctic, where this would create additional CO2 sinks. The speed of this is far slower than the dieback in the south. So in total, we do not have an additional sink. And this expansion also changes the albedo of the Earth. So this means like how much sunlight the Earth reflects. And therefore, even the expansion in the north, although acting as a carbon sink, would mean additional global warming. The central estimate of these points, so when the forest expansion and dieback would actually become an abrupt reorganization or an irreversible reorganization, is currently at 4 degrees. However, since we are also altering forests very much, we do not know the exact point when this could happen. And already at 1.5 degrees, we are at risk of crossing these tipping points. So these are just some impacts that we have looked at in this study and that we should keep in mind when talking about these forests. And I will now give over to Firza for the mitigation part.
Thank you, Dalia, for presenting the context on the status of northern forest. So I will be walking you through, can you go next, please? I will be walking you through on the status of carbon sink in this region, which are currently at risk, as the sink is currently declining in the past decade. And here I'm presenting on the right side the illustration from FAO, where you can see that sink is reduced between 2015 and 2020 in northern forest. And as explained before, climate-related impacts have already contributed to this reduction in sink, and also current forest management in the northern forest that do not protect the forest health. And from this FAO graph, we can also see that northern forest stores half of the world sink in 2020. And this further presents the urgency to be protected. And so in this presentation, I will walk you through on the model estimates on the trajectory of the northern forest carbon sink in the future based on the models, and what are the crucial protection measures for these carbon sinks. Next, please. And to understand the role of northern forest in this modeled pathways, we pick the pathways that are bound to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and are within the global sustainable limits for afforestation and bioenergy. And these pathways show that northern forests expand the sink in the future, but the level to which the sink expanded varies strongly from pathway to pathway. And this is because pathways are different in the paces on reducing fossil fuels, and they are also different on the scale of possible forest expansion that leads to the carbon sink enhancement. And they are also coming from different models who have different constructions behind it. For example, here in the middle, we have a model, a pathway from Remind MAGPIE model. And in here, the carbon sink enhancement is the lowest among all the other models. And this thing is driven by afforestation. And in Remind MAGPIE, they exclude the afforestation in boreal forest due to the albedo effects that can lead to the increase in surface temperature. So they exclude afforestation in this boreal area. That's why the carbon sink enhancement is low in Remind MAGPIE. But this is not the case in other models. If we go to MISH Glow Biome on the right, this is the only model that includes forest management that protects forest health as the measure to increase carbon sink, which results to the larger carbon sink in MISH Glow Biome than in other pathways. So this illustrates how different models have different assumptions, and this will result on various levels of carbon sink, possible carbon sinks in the future. Oh, sorry. Yeah. And in the pathways that report deforestation emissions, all pathways have all pathways show that deforestation needs to reduce and to eventually stop by 2030. Yes, next, please. And the problem with these models, they rely on afforestation, and they assume that productivity improvements can free up some lands to make ways for forest. So here is an example from Remind MAGPIE, where it shows that forests can increase from 2020 to 2030 through afforestation, and it can increase by 100 million hectares additional to the forest coverage in the 2020s. And this can only be possible if pasture land is reduced. And pasture land can be reduced if productivity in pasture land is improved. So this is what the model assumes. But in reality, this number of afforestation has always been considered as unsustainable, because it will thought to be it will pose competition with food production, biodiversity, and renewable energy rollout. But still, northern forest countries have pledged to increase forest area by 162 million hectares by 2050, and this is larger than what the models here estimate. And the countries also do not have the clarity on where it will be located, which species to use, and which methodology of planting. Will it be monoculture? Will it be enrichment plantation? So it's not clear, and it's larger than what the models estimate. Yeah, next, please. And the next challenge in this sector, in this land use sector, it's difficult to track the progress in LULUCF sector. This is because different reports have different accounting and different definition of lands. For example, here it's between national inventories and models. So national inventories have a wider coverage of managed lands than in models. And also national inventories that account for LULUCF emissions, they include both CO2 fertilization effects and anthropogenic sinks. But models, they only include anthropogenic sinks. And the problem here is that I'm taking you to the graph. I'm taking you to look into this graph. The red line represents the model estimates on LULUCF sinks, LULUCF emissions, and the green line represents the LULUCF emissions from national inventory. And the thing here is that inventories show that in the 2020s, countries' LULUCF emissions are a net sink. It's below the zero value, while models show that LULUCF is a net source. And so national inventories are used to track countries' progress, but model results are used for IPCC to benchmark where sinks could happen. So when countries and models start from different values in the past, they can't. It's difficult to compare them both because they're not comparable. So it's difficult for countries to compare their progress with LULUCF benchmarks that are based on models. But there are solutions, which is aligning the model and inventories for LULUCF emissions, but this results on pushing forward the date of net zero CO2 target to 5 years earlier than estimated in the AR6 report. And this implies that countries need to aim more ambitiously than what's been pledged. Next, please. And so now we're going into the measures to protect northern forests. First and foremost, it's important to protect the sinks that we currently have to avoid releasing the carbon that is massively stored in the soil. And that would include ending deforestation, most importantly by 2030, and to protect old growth primary forests, which store resilient carbon. And there are also measures to recover the carbon sinks that have been lost due to the unsustainable practices in the past. And just an example here on the right side, there are the most potential coming from reforestation. And this is a measure to return the sink capacity of northern forest that was lost from the clearing in the past. And then the second largest comes from the native forest management, which includes activities, harvesting activities in native forests. And this includes extending harvesting intensity or through ecological forest management, such as continuous cover forestry. But and then there is another measure, which is restoring the secondary forests and allow them to grow to the maturity and resilience levels as those in old growth forests. this presents as the largest potential in another study and could be explored further. And so the bottom line is that we need to conserve the resilient forests that we have currently and restore those with dire condition, with improving their health as the core aim of the measure. So yeah, that's all from my side. And we actually have another report ongoing that will be coming on soon. It's a guide on the LUCF sector on what is the progress, international policy progress in this sector. So yeah, thank you for your attention. And I'm passing it over to Eric.
Thank you so much for you and for Dalia for this brilliant presentation. It's super interesting, and is interesting to see how both reports they complement each other. No, one emphasize what's going wrong, let's say, how is going the climate change is impacting the forest, and you Firza, you're bringing ways of addressing and saying what the models can bring to us, and looking forward to the future. And I would like to invite our other speakers, our discussants, to this conversation. Please, I would invite all of them to turn their camera on. And I would like to present them to you. First of all, I would like to present the Wendell trio. He is a climate change and policy analyst. He is expert on UNFCCC process and the biodiversity COP. The second discussant is Hannes Bocher. He's from OCO Institute, and he's expert in the LUCF, in accounting rules. He will be able to delve and explain a bit further about all the difference of the accountants that Firza mentioned to us. And the discussion 3 is Jennifer Skin. Is an expert of Natural Resource Defense Council, and she will bring the North American perspective on logging and forest degradation, and will highlight this importance of the sustainable practices in order to defend our northern forests. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Wendell Trio to the first remarks about how northern forests are being discussed in this international arena. I'm curious, and I believe everyone is, to see if the policymakers are giving as much as attention as northern forests need in these international arenas. Please, Wendell.
Yes, thank you, Eriki. And yeah, thank you to Firza and Dalia for the interesting presentations. I think from the two reports, we get two big messages, as Eric already said, which one is a positive one, the other is a more negative message. On the positive side, clearly northern forests can play an important role in climate change mitigation, and that is kind of a positive message that is urgently needed, as we're strongly lagging behind in terms of mitigation, and that the fossil fuel phase out that is needed is not yet underway in the speed that is needed. So it's good that we have that positive message, but the negative message is that northern forests are under threat, partly by climate change, but probably even more importantly by logging practices and unsustainable forest management that is taking place in most of the northern forest countries. And so this is surprising, and as said in the presentation, northern forests account for almost half of the carbon sinks in forests, so they're very important. At the same time, they don't get the recognition that they need. If you go to any of the UN meetings, when they talk about forests, most people will automatically think about tropical forests rather than northern forests, and they mostly see the problem as being a problem for developing countries rather than a problem for developed countries. That is an important issue that we see in the UN meetings, but also on the ground we see clearly a problem. While almost or more than 20% of tropical forests are in some way of protected status, that is less than 10% for northern forests. So in general, northern forests are much less protected than tropical forests, and that's of course having an impact on its future and how it's being treated. This report, and in particular the mitigation report, should clearly help make progress on a number of issues in the international institutions. The first one, most important one, is the debate around synergies between biodiversity and climate change. Important statements have been made both by the last meeting of the UN Forum on Forest, as well as by the last biodiversity summit in Colombia, calling for bigger synergies. Unfortunately, no answer has yet been given by the UNFCCC, and we're hoping that with the Brazilian presidency of COP30 taking place in November of this year, they have put synergies on biodiversity and climate change as one of their priorities, and we hope that that debate can progress. Next to that, we've seen some positive developments with the global stocktake that took place in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that was concluded in late 2023. There is a specific paragraph in the global stocktake, paragraph 33, that calls for halting and reversing deforestation and forest degradation. This is important to have both references, because deforestation is generally being considered as an issue in developing countries, because that's when forests are being converted mostly to agricultural lands, while forest degradation is more specifically referring to the forests in developed countries, the northern forest, because that is the process of forests being cut, logged, and replaced by new plantations. So it's very important that both are in, but still it's very important that both of these terms remain in the debate. And what we've seen, for instance, in the discussions in the OECD climate change expert group, where they were discussing how to transfer the GST outcomes into NDCs, that also there the paragraph 33 was mostly focusing on deforestation, but luckily, with the help of a number of NGOs, this got corrected, and now there's clear recommendations from the OECD that both developed and developing countries should ensure the integration of the global stocktake references to forests into their future NDC. In a similar way, the UN Economic Forum for Europe, which basically brings together all of the countries hosting northern forests, have recognized the northern forests challenges and will be developing a program to work on that. So a number of positive elements seeing in the international debate, but we'll also need to see how countries will take this report seriously in their national work, in particular in their NDCs. A number of countries have already put forward their NDCs, nationally determined contributions, but many more need to do so. And we hope that also their northern forest countries will clearly include policies and measures to strengthen and support the role of northern forests and the importance of northern forests, both in terms of climate change mitigation, but of course also in terms of biodiversity protection and the protection of the rights of indigenous peoples. I will leave it there and give back the floor to you, Eriki. Thanks.
Thanks, Wendell. Thanks. Super clear, and I believe that is raising a lot of questions for our attendees. We will have the question and answer session just after this presentation part, and I would like to remind everyone that we have the Q&A button in the bottom of your Zoom bar. Now I'm passing the ball to Hans Bocher, connecting a bit with these accounting rules, thinking what Wendell is bringing to us is important to raise the discussion of northern forests in the international arena, and also bring the report that we have different types of accounting rules. The countries are using one, the IPCC is using models that they perhaps not speak to each other in the best way that they should. I would like you to bring your thoughts on that, and please take the floor.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having me here to comment on these two very interesting and also important reports. I have 5 points I would like to make. First is the first report is a year old but it's still very timely. I mean, we have seen the massive fires in Canada, and the report is featuring those in the review. But also last year we had big fires in Canada and the Northern Hemisphere that were maybe not of that severity, but also way above the average of the last decade. So it's still a pressing issue. And of course, we have also still the curve of CO2 emissions increasing and the concentration in the atmosphere. And what I like about the first report is that it highlights there is actually the atmosphere just taking up half of the carbon we are emitting to it. It's the ocean and the land that are absorbing for free every second ton we are emitting. So it could be placed as a very generous Mother Nature we have there, and we need to keep this in mind. And this is also reflected later in the report on how we are counting actually those impacts of emissions. The second point I would like to make is exactly on reporting and accounting. And I find at some point the report is a bit mingling these two, and it's important to differentiate. So there's reporting where numbers are created by countries on the accounts of their greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And then there's accounting of those numbers against the target. Why is it important to separate the two? Because the reporting guidelines are quite strict. There are methods provided by IPCC, and what has to be reported how is quite well prescribed. But the accounting is the issue. So what is actually the target we are aiming at, and how do we compare the reported numbers to the target? Do we actually meet it? And here the report rightly states we have this issue between greenhouse gas inventories reported by countries and the integrated assessment models that are setting the target of 1.5 or 2 degrees. And the question is here not who is right or wrong. It's basically two different views on the topic. However, I think one has to acknowledge that the greenhouse gas inventories are actually often, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, derived from national forest inventories that are quite accurate measures of what the carbon content is in forests. And so they can be trusted. Of course, they are they are reporting everything that is happening in the forest. So it's also the uptake of carbon due to CO2 fertilization. It's also the disturbances being recorded in there. And I think the integrated assessment models, they have to actually better reflect the different influences on carbon storage and emissions and removals to make the numbers match and have the correct interpretation and the correct comparison of these two terms. But I think it's a bit difficult to state that greenhouse gas inventories have to change. They have been agreed by the whole community of UNFCCC, and it's difficult to change these rules. But it's easy to adapt, and we do have the numbers. It's simply a translation issue. And the communities are working on this, which is very timely. What is still an issue is the completeness of greenhouse gas inventories. So still on soils, we have not so well-established numbers and methodologies like for biomass, for example. So also the greenhouse gas inventory community has homework to do. A closer look maybe at the pathways and models that were reviewed by the report. I think it is quite remarkable, and the report also states this rightly, that forests in these tools are quite rudimentary, which is unfortunate because they have such a strong role to play in the global carbon cycle. And they are quite optimistic in terms of projections of what can be done with measures on the land and in forests. They are too optimistic because often the costs are much higher actually to establish measures and implement measures in forests. The models are often not considering all the costs that are associated with these kind of measures. Also, they lack maybe the effectiveness of the measures. So it's difficult, of course, for a global model to correctly assess what the effectiveness of measures are in particular areas of a country or at regional scale. And then, of course, many of these tools do not account for natural disturbances and the feedback of climate change on those. And so, taken all together, there's a quite optimistic estimate of what can be done with measures in the forest sector. What I would like to recommend is that in the future you differentiate a bit more measures also at the hectare level. We've seen large numbers, I mean, several gigatons of potential that can be achieved with dealing with forest-related mitigation measures. But actually, they are so big numbers because it's such a large area that potentially can be used for these measures. But in fact, there are other measures like the rewetting of organic soils, for example, that are more effective at the hectare level. So you need smaller areas to deal with. And I think, assuming that we can afforest, for example, millions of hectares with a rather small benefit at the hectare level is also leading to this overestimation of potentials in the forest. One point on very important conclusions I liked in the report. I think that ending fossil fuel emissions is essential, needs to be iterated more and more and more. It's not the forests that are to blame if they don't do the job that they are doing for free. And especially looking at these hidden emissions that are not showing up in the atmosphere concentration because carbon is taken up by oceans and the forest. And the land is really something we have to highlight much more. So they're doing already a very good job despite the fires and despite the disturbances we see and the challenges we have with the land sink. That makes it even more important to stress we need these separate targets. It cannot be that we have a fossil global economic target where forests and land is included. We need a separate target that's much more oriented also towards restoration. So not aiming at the highest possible amount of removals from land, but really sustained restoration of the of ecosystems. One point I found missing in the report is the term adaptation doesn't occur in any of the reports. Maybe it's a bit anthropocentric view, but I find adaptation is really currently the challenge among forest owners in especially temperate zones, where they're looking for ways to restore the forest in a way that is resilient to climate change. And I think here much more support is needed. So it's not simply that we can leave the forest alone and reduce harvest. This will not do the job by itself, but we need much more guidance on how to, at the really small scale, deal with the challenge of climate change impacts on forests and transition towards more resilient forests. And with this, I would like to leave it here and thank you again. Happy to take questions. Handing over to Eric.
Thank you so much, Hannes. So last but not least, the discussion 3, Jennifer, really keen to hear from her about the sustainable practices and how this can weaken this northern forest and what it's going to do to revert this trend. Please, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric and Tessa and all the organizers of this great event. I'm extremely grateful to Climate Analytics for its work on this really critical topic. The report's findings are particularly important because they included what so many discussions of climate change and northern forests don't, and that's the role of industrial impacts in both fueling climate change itself and in impairing northern forest resilience to growing climate change stressors like wildfires and insects. So when it comes to climate impacts in northern forests, the logging industry in North America, in fact, has used the risk of increasing wildfires to advocate for itself, saying we need more logging to mitigate them. The reality, as Dahlia mentioned earlier, is far different. It's a very nuanced issue, so there's no necessarily one size fits all, but established science actually shows that younger, less diverse forests tend to be less resilient to fires and to other stressors. Logging changes hydrology and other characteristics that can make wildfires more frequent and severe. In the boreal in Canada, evidence points to the fact that younger, densely stocked, regrown forests following clear cutting are more susceptible to wildfires. So, in Canada, particularly where wildfires are top of mind, but really around the world, this is a really critical issue. And the conclusion is we need to be protecting older forests, not cut them down. One other problem is that in making wildfires the target of public angst, it deflects attention from the very real, very controllable impact that the logging industry is having on forests and its species and communities. One thing to note is that the logging industry isn't the fossil fuel industry. It can be compatible with a climate-safe future, and it can play a role in helping the world to adapt. But that's unfortunately not the reality we have today. So industrial logging is vast in northern countries like Canada and the US and many European countries like Sweden and places like Australia. And it's intensive, it's industrial, with clear cutting as the predominant model, leaving almost no trees behind and really leaving that ecosystem irrevocably changed. So in Canada, for example, the industry clear cuts more than 500,000 hectares of forest each year. And much of this is in irrecoverable primary and old growth forests. Researchers led by a group from Griffith University in Australia actually found that since 1976, logging in Ontario and Quebec, two of the Canadian provinces, has affected 35.4 million acres of boreal forest, which is an area that's approximately the size of New York State. So in the US as well, industrial logging is still occurring at a very high rate in old growth and mature federal forests, and clear cutting is a predominant model. For decades, as the climate analytics report mentions, this has been classified as quote unquote sustainable forest management. But the concept of sustainable forest management, as the report mentions, has an outsized focus on economic sustainability. It's not, in fact, ecologically sustainable in many, if not most, cases. A massive clear cut in a primary forest in Canada with logging roads and landings piles falls under the category of sustainable forest management. It also, by the way, as Wendell alluded to, isn't considered deforestation. So despite those 500,000 plus hectares that are clear cut each year in Canada, the country claims near zero deforestation. The impact on species has been catastrophic, and so has the impact on the climate. The report obviously provides a really alarming picture of what runaway warming will mean for northern forests. Well, logging doesn't just impact forest resilience to climate change, it's actually fueling it. But as Hans mentioned, the numbers get really erased through creative accounting. So actually looking at emissions data out of Canada using the government's own figures, in 2022, which is the most recently reported year, the net logging emissions were 147 megatons, which makes logging the third highest emitting sector of the Canadian economy after oil and gas and transport. So just to wrap up, when we talk about climate change in northern forests, we also have to recognize that this is climate change driven in part by how these forests are being used and managed. There are many, many myths around northern forests and climate change, as we've started to delve into today. And the report does a really great job of starting to peel back those false narratives and deflection and looking at these issues of impacts, natural and anthropogenic, in tandem. the main conclusion is we need to protect older forests to give them the best chance of surviving in a changing climate. We need to protect older forests to avoid fueling a changing climate. And we need real solutions that are grounded in real science. And this report really helps to start getting us there. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights. And I'm gladly seeing that there are some questions popping up already in the Q&A button. Eric Phil is asking a follow-up question. That I think is for you, Jennifer. Can the recent Canadian wildfires be linked to managed forest areas, or it's more or less equally bad in natural forests? I also invited to all the speakers to please turn the camera on, and let's have this debate now.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Eric. It's a really good one. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I do know that, there was obviously burning in both the managed and the unmanaged forest areas. It's a bit tricky because also the further north you go, which goes outside the managed forest, those forests are sort of naturally more susceptible to more frequent wildfires and shorter fire rotations. I think in certain cases there is more fire outside of the managed forest, and others it might be the opposite. It sort of depends on where you are, and I don't have the numbers from those specifically 2023 fires. But the science is pretty clear that in many cases, logging, industrial logging from clear cutting does make the forest more susceptible. So there's a lot of factors at play in terms of where the fires are actually happening, but that has been pretty clearly shown.
Thank you so much. We have another question about the report. So Robin Webster, one thing, if any one of the attendees feel more comfortable to raise the hand, I can give the floor also. So we have another option besides only writing. You can also raise your hand. But Robin Webster already wrote, and he wrote the following. The report says that aligning the different accounting system for land means that the date of net zero CO2 comes 5 years earlier than estimating our AR6, the IPCC report. That would appear to mean that governments need to reduce emissions faster than they are currently planning to do in their NDCs, because they can't rely on land to do it to the same extent. Is there any sign of this being taken into account at the political level? I would pass the floor to either Wendell or Firza to comment on that.
I mean, I think also Hannes wanted to react, but I can, as far as I know, there's no real kind of taking into account of these conclusions into countries' debates. And actually, you have to see that in a larger context, which is that we've had year after year the UN Environment Programme with their emissions gap report, but also the UNFCCC with their synthesis report, stating that countries' climate pledges, their NDCs, are not aligned with reaching 1.5, a bit irrespective of the forest accounting issue. So we're not on track anyway, and governments are not taking those warnings into account. So I think definitely this needs to be better aligned into the climate pledges, but we're far away from trajectories where we're really 1.5 aligned.
Hannes, please complement a bit the answer.
Yeah, what I can say is that the IPCC has taken up this process. So there was a large meeting last year where the experts talked. But as you know, these procedures and processes, they take time until the information is then trickling down to the decision makers and more those who are actually then responsible for taking measures. It's a delicate issue because, as Wendell said, I mean, we have, there is a gap already, and simply stating, oh, the gap is actually now 6 gigatons larger doesn't really help the process. Also regarding, I mean, how reliant are the numbers actually we're talking about? This is really causing a large risk to the overall process. So it's also about wording. It's also about how to communicate on this. We have to reduce fossil fuel emissions. I mean, that's a message we can convey any way, need to convey anyway. But yeah, it's really only starting now at the expert level, and this will take longer.
Thanks so much, both of you. Firza, do you want to complement something, or that's okay?
Yes, I agree with the inputs from Hannes and Wendell, but I would like to comment from the modeling perspective. So basically, this method to align different accounting systems is rather new. It was published last year, and it has only been applied in the recent iteration of AR6 pathways that are in the IPCC database, and there is a chance that the new iteration of pathways has not yet aligned to the national inventories. And this is still an ongoing discussion in the modeling community, so to allow comparison between IPCC benchmarks and national inventories. So yeah, so that's just an input from the modeling community.
Thanks so much. We have another question for Lilian Bosch. The question focused now in the Swedish forests. What would be the most impactful solution for climate mitigation in countries like Sweden, where less than 10% of the forests are still primary forests and more than 9% are plantations? Since much of the remaining old-growth forests are fragmented throughout the country, how big does a conservation forest area need to be impactful? All single stretches count. Oh, okay. She means that how big in size, in extension of the forest that should be able to apply conservation efforts, or if there are scattered throughout the countries is also counting. I don't know, Jennifer. Perhaps if with your experience in other types of the other North American forests, can you give some idea of your experience about the size of forests?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm certainly not going to attempt to speak to Swedish forests in particular, but even in North America, there's been far greater degradation and cumulative impacts than one might think. And so, for example, that study I mentioned from Griffith University in Ontario and Quebec, there were only 8 patches of areas that were larger than 50,000 hectares contiguously that hadn't been previously industrially disturbed. And so unfortunately, somewhat arbitrarily, policy has given an outsized focus to these very large stretches. Obviously, you know, having a contiguous area is beneficial, but what that's meant is we are missing these smaller areas that are still incredibly important from a climate and a species perspective. So the response there would be the same, which is to keep those areas under protection, safeguard those remaining primary and old growth forests, and to broaden policy beyond this idea of these kind of broad, very large intact forest landscapes to really capture those small areas. The one other thing I'll mention is, of course, here in the US, we have a very extensive history of degrading our forests. Forests in Massachusetts, for example, many of those were cut centuries ago, and they are now coming back, and they are reaching the age or have passed the age of maturity. So one other dynamic is that we need to be letting these forests that are returning after industrial impacts is from a century ago or previous to continue to regrow. It's a concept called proforestation, allowing these forests to reach maturity and protecting those in perpetuity.
Thank you, Jennifer. Eric, I'm seeing that you have your hands on. If you are able to speak, please do. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't know if you can see me, but I'll pose a question at least. So I heard Hannes saying that we can't just rely on, harvesting less and leaving forests. We also need to do some like, as you said, kind of local management. Could you delve a bit further into what you mean by that, please?
Please, Hans.
Yes, I think an issue with changes in forest management is with the baseline. So we need to consider what would have been the management without the decision we are now changing the management in the forest. And often these alternatives are changing the supply of wood from forests. I mean, ultimately, we are interested in leaving more wood in the forest, obviously, but this might cause leakage if you do this on a regional basis and don't consider an entire country or continent. This is also what models show. Timber is a globally traded product, so it's understandable that this could become easily from somewhere else. So the question is here, where do we actually cause leakage effects? And then really the question on what is the development of the forest without more intensive forest management. We do have models to test that, but as I said, also the consideration of disturbances is often not very well elaborated in these models. So often we cannot observe the alternative development of these forests. And as Jennifer also already said, we do have forests, especially in Central Europe, that are reaching maturity, that are not well placed. They are in the wrong place, basically, spruce forests that are now dying back. What do we do there? Can we have alternative management options there? And what is the, if you wish, counterfactual scenario? If we let them grow further, then spruce will regenerate in many places. So we need to have really well-adapted local solutions there. Maybe that's one part of the answer.
Thank you, Hans. I don't see any other question in the Q&A session. Perhaps I can pose one myself, if everyone's agreed. Why do models, Firza, why do models only consider afforestation, reforestation as the main method to increase sinks?
Yeah, that's a very typical question that I encounter in working with models that show the LULUCF things. So actually the inclusion of these measures really depends on the modules being used to simulate land cover uses. It's just that like in the selection of our 1.5 aligned pathways, we couldn't see any other models in the AR6 database that include forest management that fall within our limit of sustainable carbon sink. And then what I meant by carbon sinks depend on the land use models that these bigger models use is, for example, Remind is modeling energy systems as a primary part, and it is coupled with MAGPIE to model land use changes. And MAGPIE itself emphasizes cost-effective agriculture-related decisions in order to fulfill energy and food demand. But MAGPIE do not decide anything about forest. There is no activities that we assume in MAGPIE. MAGPIE only follows what decisions have been made in agriculture. If agriculture had to be expanded, then MAGPIE expanded agriculture and reduces forests. But if agriculture is abandoned, then MAGPIE expanded forest, and the easiest way to include this is afforestation. And then in GloBiome, they have another module. It's called, in Message, they have another land model. It's called GloBiome. And in GloBiome, they have like this consideration whether they want to include afforestation or they want to include forest management, depending on the carbon price incentives. So it really depends on the models inside the primary models to get the either afforestation or forest management, but usually it's using the models that have afforestation inside the construction.
Okay, thank you so much, Firza, for this nice explanation of your report, of the method that you use in your modeling. I would like, since it's already 5, the time flew, and I would like to thank you so much to every one of you. It was a wonderful time to be here to exchange these ideas. Congratulations, Dalia and Firza, for these outstanding reports. And that highlighted how daunting, challenging are to take care of the northern forests, but how important the northern forests are, and how the policymakers should take care of them in the way that that needs. So restoration practice, so stopping deforestation that is necessary and is necessary to be taken as soon as possible.